Okay, so what I was addressing last, I want to now clarify, which is the issue of states' rights. Okay, so if one could argue that the South was starting to feel like there was unfair pressure coming from the North over their right to slavery, um, many Northerners felt the same way. And here's one example. So um, we have the Fugitive Slave Act that basically said that um, a slave can has to be returned to a slave state, that it's private property. Okay, and ultimately, what it came down to is that if you were a slaver and you brought a slave into a free state, by default, you're not a free state anymore, right? Because that person has a slave. Or if that slave is still considered a slave and can be returned, again, you aren't a free state. So how could this union exist with slavery and non-slavery? One had to violate the rights of the other. This was one of the problems that many felt. So Northerners and Southerners felt like having these two different systems ultimately was violating, the sovereignty and the ideas of each respective state. Okay, so I want you to think about it that way. Now, I'm just gonna diverge just for a second and talk about there being other trends at the time. So it wasn't like everybody was only thinking about the topics of slavery, although we are mainly focusing on that. But you also had things going on in Europe taking place. And you had this one group at the time called Young American Democrats. And I kind of briefly want to just kind of slide into this, which is also set up in the section anyways, which is to say that we Americans are so big that we still often forget that there's the rest of the world, right? And, if we're talking about just understanding the Middle East and Africa, let alone just Europe. Now, in the 1848, there were all these uprisings, kind of like what we saw with the Middle East several years ago, where country after country just had this wave of riots and demonstrations trying to overthrow their dictatorships, mainly ones that the United States and the Western countries supported. That's right, folks. And French ones also, like in Tunisia, French meaning French supported. That's a whole other complicated topic. But there were these revolts wanting to create new free societies, and in a sense, I think it makes sense that for young Americans or to look at this and get wrapped up in what's going on in the rest of Europe, and then kind of articulate it into the way that would fit an American agenda. So they kind of wanted to spread Jeffersonian concepts of democracy, but advocating more technology, more infrastructure, free markets, really into capitalism, really against aristocrats, although we didn't have any here, but in theory, at least got to say, off with the head with the kings kind of thing. And to really, perhaps even take more territories, kind of wrapped up in this manifest destiny. Different ones had a little different interpretation of that. It's not as straightforward as just being militaristic. And then the slavery got mixed up in the issue as well. And for some, that's going to work, and others it's not. And so we return back to that topic. And in the middle of these ideas of America growing and infrastructure, which I want to talk about, such as the Young Americans, railroads were going to be seen as something very positive to helping develop, connection of the United States. And how are you going to be united and have a union if you don't have clear transportation systems that connect everybody? The problem is, as I addressed to you in some earlier lectures, is that the expansion of the United States and the question of slavery is going to affect something like the issues of the railroad. So where does the railroad start? In a free state or a slave state? Secretary of War Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, you're going to see his name later on. He's going to become the first and only president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi sent Southern Railroad builder James Gadsden to buy a portion of Mexico. In 1853, he persuaded Mexico to accept $10 million for a strip of land now comprising part of Arizona and New Mexico, and then in turn intensified this debate. Because now think about this. If you're a slave owner, you can have a whole cargo full of your slaves in a slave state with or can a free state take I mean, you know, what if the guy who owns the railroad has slaves working in the food service? And so you come into a free state and all of the labor in the on the train is supported by slave labor. I mean, there's so many questions, there's so many variables. This is, again, a problem. Okay, now it gets more complicated. So Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas wanted railroad in his section, and then he organized this bill in 1850s. Now remember, we're talking about this like the crisis of the 1850s. That was the how I titled these PowerPoints from the beginning. And basically the Nebraska-Kansas Act said this. Well, okay, so the Missouri Compromise was essentially that there was this kind of imaginary line and there was just going to be slave states and free states. Kind of ends that. The Nebraska-Kansas Act says basically as new states were brought in, people could vote whether or not they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. So now every state is a wild card. Which side will it be on? And what's going to end up happening is you're going to have people literally moving to new states to support, to be a fact on the ground and help tilt a state to be a slave state or a free state. I mean, literally entire families of people are going to get up and move to an entire different state by wagon to say yes to slavery or no to slavery. And it's going to get a little bit more ugly than just that, because it's going to be beyond just the voting. Okay, so Bleeding Kansas, which we're going to cover very heavily, and when you watch this long documentary on John Brown. Okay, and this is what I really label the beginning of the Civil War. Okay, in actuality. So there was a lot of corruption. I mean, so keep in mind this is the Western frontiers being made. It's sort of a lawless world, right? Because remember, we're having these frontiers folk establishing homesteads, bringing their guns and their family, and basically trying to survive on their own with not a whole lot of law and order in the way that we would expect, and it's very localized. So what do you do if the police or the politicians are all, let's say, coming in from the slave states or the free states? Are things really happening in a fair way? Well, 1855, we had 1,500 legal voters, but it said that 6,000 voted. Oh, something was wrong. Okay? There were thousands of pro-slavery Missourians. Okay? Then there was free staters, meaning people who want to be a free state, made their own legislation. President Pierce denounced the free staters as basically usurping. Okay, so this is already a civil war. This is already a breaking up into two camps. You see what I'm saying here? Okay, and so violence was inevitable. This was not a United States. This was not a united state, and the people who were in support of slavery and the people who were against it only kind of really saw the law as useful if it was going to promote their side and make it happen. But there were other means in which both sides were going to end up using to kind of help create the environment in which they were favoring. I will end here and I'll move on to the next lecture.